Hi everybody, Steve Denny here again for podcast number 35. Thanks for joining us. This time it's going to be something a little different than what we've done in the past, and I guess I need to sort of prep this just a bit for you, because we're got a podcast here where I'll tell you right up front, we're not going to talk about guns. The importance of this presentation is a learning experience about the judicial system and things that can go wrong. And this is a classic case of how justice has been subverted, abused, and innocent people have been wrongly accused and convicted of a crime that was not even a crime as far as we know, and certainly wasn't committed by the people who were ultimately brought to trial and convicted for it. The presentation is, as you've come to expect from some of ours, a presentation that was made at an LFI class at the Firearms Academy of Seattle. The gentleman doing the presentation, cautionary information about, I hate to call it a justice system because this isn't justice, but it is what happens when justice goes wrong.
Okay, class, we're going to take a few minutes and hear from an attorney from Minnesota named Mr. Jim Fleming. Jim and I have been corresponding for a number of months now since he joined the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network as a network-affiliated attorney. And we find out that we have many things in common, and at my invitation he came out to participate in this LFI class. And he has worked on a specific case which I think gives a very good example of what can happen to good innocent people when a prosecutor gets the mindset that they want to get a conviction at any cost. Is that fair to say there, Jim?
Yes.
Okay, so without any further ado, let me introduce Jim Fleming.
Moss and Marty asked me to spend about 30 minutes talking to you about a case that I was responsible for handling through the latter part of 2005 and literally all of the year 2006. It was a first-degree murder case. It occurred very near my home, which is located about 25 miles northwest of Minneapolis. And I'm going to use the blackboard just briefly from time to time to help you try to keep track of the players that were involved in this situation. So I'm going to be moving away from the podium just a little bit from time to time, and I hope that you don't mind. Basically, here's the situation. In August of 1979, we had three individuals that I'll refer to as A, B, and C simply so that you can keep track of who they were and what they did, who got involved in a situation in which another individual, D, wound up dead, laying alongside a county road in a county just south of my home, approximately about 18 miles. After the four of them had been at a bar in another community approximately 25, 26 miles away. A and B were friends, knew each other. C did not know either A or B, nor did they know D, or did he know D. D also worked with A and B at a place where they manufactured pre-stressed, not pre-stressed, but what am I trying to say, the rafters in houses. There you go. Exactly, thank you. All right, they were at the bar, all of them just coincidentally. There was a young woman that at the time the bar closed invited everybody that was in the social group that she was involved with to her home for what in Minnesota is referred to as an after-bar party. I'm from Nebraska. We didn't have after-bar parties. If we hadn't hooked up by the time the bars closed, it was a losing proposition. At that time, we went home, went to bed. These guys were trying to give it another shot, so they were going to go to the after-bar party. So they all managed to go to the after-bar party 25 miles away in another community. Now, D was hitchhiking. He was picked up hitchhiking by A and B, who said, hey, we know you don't live very far from where this party's taking place. Why don't you come with us to the party? We'll hang out for a little while, and we'll take you home. So, fine. C, my client, coincidentally, Also lived very close to the place where the party was being held. He thought, what the hell, okay, I'll go and have a couple more beers and then I'll go home, go to bed. His fiancée, incidentally, was working at the Federal Cartridge Factory in Anoka, Minnesota that night on a graveyard shift. She wasn't with him. So they all end up making the trip. As D, A, and B drive to the party, they get within a couple of blocks of the party, they suddenly end up with a flat tire on B's car. As a result of that, and because the spare tire was flat in B's trunk, they walked to a filling station where they saw another vehicle very similar to his, which was a 1972 Impala. And they used his jack, and they jacked the car up. They stole a tire off that, left their spare tire, went back to the party. And of course, because they're young guys during this time, what are they doing? They're drinking beer. So by the time they got the tire stolen, rolled it back to the house, drank beer, got the tire changed, they've had enough beer so that they're telling D now, you know what? At this hour of the night, the only people that are out are drunks and cops. So we're not going to take you home right now because I'm too drunk to drive, and so we're going to wait for a while, all right? Well, that doesn't make D very happy. D decides, no, I'm tired. There's nobody here I'm going to hook up with. Nobody knows me at this party. I'm going to leave the party, and he does. Approximately an hour later, 2.5 miles north of the party site, he is found dead, laying alongside the road with a massive head wound, and he has bled out and pumped literally all the blood in his body out on the side of the road. He is laying, if this is the roadway, he is laying in this position right here. He's dressed entirely in black. He has long black hair. He's wearing non-reflective clothing. And as I told the jury later on during the trial, you could take the clothes off his body, put them on and wear them to church the next Sunday, and nobody would know the difference. There were no wounds to the face other than a massive wound here where there was a scrape that had torn the scalp clear to the skull, and that's the area where he bled out. There was no bleeding from the nose, there was no bleeding from the mouth, no bleeding from the other ear. It was simply this massive scrape alongside the head, and in the autopsy they determined that he had what's known as a basilar skull fracture. If you take your finger and touch it to the roof of your mouth, you're touching the hard palate, but above the hard palate, you're looking at the base of the skull. It's the thickest bone in the skull. Very, very hard to fracture. It was fractured, his skull was fractured literally from this area here, all the way through that area and around over here. If you know anything about anatomy, which I didn't at the time, through that basal skull run the two carotid arteries that pump blood to the brain. They transverse through that area. When the skull was cracked in the manner that it was, it ruptured those and he bled out and all the blood escaped through the wound on the side of his head. So here he is. All right, so we're back in 1979. Now they started an investigation at that point in time and they eventually found out about this relationship and this party. They interviewed all the people that had gone to the party. They questioned them at length. Didn't find anything. They questioned another individual who, after hearing about the death, came forward and said, hey, that night I drove right by that area. And I drove by there at 3 o'clock in the morning after a card party, and I saw a car out there, and this car was a 67 to 69 Chevy Impala that had taillights, 3 on each side, that were round on the top and flat on the bottom. In other words, like this. I saw a bunch of guys standing around outside the car. They were talking, they were doing this, that, the other thing. I had my wife with me. It didn't seem to be a problem. We drove on by and left. Now that became important later, as you can see, because B owned a 1972 Impala. The chief investigator at the time spent a lot of time looking over the case. They looked at all the interviews they were conducting. They finally came to the conclusion, we got nothing here. He went to the sheriff and he told the sheriff, I think this was a hit and run. I think this kid was hitchhiking out alongside a dark road, no light anywhere, at that hour of the morning, and somebody came along somehow and clipped him, either didn't know it or did, and they drove off, and that's what we've got. So the case languishes from that time, which was about 1980, until the year 2003. What happens then is that D, who was what I referred to with the jury as a prodigious spreader of pollen, he had fathered 3 illegitimate children at the time of his death, and he was only 21 years old. One of his illegitimate children grew up, mother died of cancer, she gets adopted, she comes back at a later point in time, now 2003, and she wants to find her birth parents, and so she goes and she does some investigating. She finds out her mother died of cancer, she goes to the family, and she finds out about D, okay? So she goes to the sheriff's office and she says, well, how come nothing was ever done about this? I mean, he was killed, you didn't do anything, nobody was arrested, and so my father died and nobody knows why or how. What are you going to do about that? Well, now this is when it gets interesting. Because there was a deputy sheriff at that time that got into the old closed files, pulled out the file on the initial investigation that had been done clear back here in 1979 and 1980, and decided he was going to reopen the case. So he does that. He can't get enough manpower from the sheriff's office to go ahead and run a good investigation, because that involves going back and re-interviewing everybody that they can find, doing all of the things that cops do, reading the reports, going back doing the re-interviews, going through the whole thing, sifting it out to see if they can find what Moss referred to as something they could pry with. And so he goes to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. I know I'm just throwing this up here. Kind of gets all muddled up and everything, but I'm trying to do this quick. Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in Minnesota is the investigative agency that you would refer to as your state police. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has experienced, trained investigators, and they have a cold case unit, all right? So he goes to the cold case unit and he says, hey, I got this deal back in 1979. I think it was a murder, and I need your help. Well, they look at it and they say, well, gee, we'd like to help you, but the death certificate says massive head trauma, unknown origin. We can't get our cold case people involved in it unless it was a homicide. So the deputy goes to the county coroner. Marty and I had a conversation earlier today about county coroners. This is a woman who has written several books in which she talks about communication with dead people. All right? She's maybe just a little bit on the strange side to begin with. They explain to her that they can't get the BCA involved unless the BCA says or unless she says it's a homicide. She takes the death certificate, reviews it, comes back and says, well, based on my review of the autopsy report and the photographs, this looks like a murder to me, and bingo, we got these guys involved. All right? Now, they go back and they look at all of this stuff, and incidentally, all 3 of these guys were interviewed back at that point in time, and they basically told what they had to say about the situation. Yeah, they knew him. Yeah, they were with him that night. Here's what happened. Yeah, we stole the tire. You know, cuff us if you want to, but what the hell are you going to do now? It's been about 20-some years. We were bad guys, but we stole the tire. All right? Well, what they decide to do is now they're going to go back and they're going to re-interview each one of them. Now, here's where the problem starts. The problem is, in the meantime, all of these guys have gotten much older. My client ends up being an administrator for the state of Minnesota, working with the Department of Administration. He's got about a $7 to $11 million budget. He's got about 50 employees, and life is good until he starts to develop some symptomology of some various things, lupus and chronic fatigue syndrome and things of that nature, and eventually ends up in a situation where he is in such pain and taking so much medication to control this that he can't work anymore. He loses his job, he's on medical disability, and he suffers from big gaps in his memory, okay? They go back and they interview A. A says, look, I haven't got anything to tell you that I didn't tell you the first time. It's been 20-some years. I don't remember half that crap anymore. But I can tell you, basically, we didn't have anything to do with it. We took him to the party. We didn't want to give him a ride while we were drunk. And so we decided to walk, and that's the last time we saw him. And he left the house at 3 o'clock in the morning. Remember Mr. X, the guy that saw the car that said that he went by at 3 o'clock in the morning? Okay. Well, now car, 3 o'clock. The guy left the party house at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2.5 miles. Okay? That's important to remember. So then they decided, well, we're going to interview B. Now, B is a nice enough guy. He's got a couple of DWIs on his record, hasn't really been in a lot of trouble, but he is a guy of low average intelligence, tends to be a very emotional individual, and they take him in, and maybe this is the important reason that we're talking about this, because they take him in and they conduct a 7.5-hour interview with him. They put him in a room with 3 cops, and they basically start to question him, and he's telling them over and over again, yes, I knew him, and yeah, I knew him, but this guy I've never seen before in my life, okay? And I don't know what's going on here, but we didn't have anything to do with this. And gradually over that 7.5-hour period, they worked him, and what I use the phrase is, they cooked him to the point where they ended up getting a confession from him to the murder, in which he implicates A, himself as the driver of the car, and C, my client, as the guy that killed this fellow. He hit him in the head with either a hockey stick, a baseball bat, or an ice skate. I'm not really sure which. And they said to him, well, no problem, because we found a baseball bat in the trunk of your car back in 1979 when we did the investigation that had blood and hair on it. Okay? They told him it had the victim's blood and hair on it. Only problem was, that was a lie. There was a baseball bat in the trunk of his car. It didn't have any blood on it. It didn't have any hair on it. It was a baseball bat. Okay, these kids went out and played softball and baseball, pick-up games, sit around in the park, drink beer, run for fly balls, stuff like that. But they told him that the bat had blood and hair from the victim on it, and that was one of the means that they used to cook him. And they also told him that his car was seen by Mr. X out at the scene where the body was found. As a result of that, he wound up giving them a confession that we later determined was a false confession, and what I had to do was I had to take the videotape of that interview and send it to an expert out of Berkeley, California by the name of Richard Offshee, who is a nationally known, internationally known expert in the area of false, coerced confessions. And I sent it to him and I said, look, just look at the videotape, tell me what you think, will you do that much? And he said, yes. He said, you can't afford to have me come back as an expert witness in this case. All right, because I charge too much money. My client and his family were able to come up with $30,000. They said, that's all we have. All right. Well, it didn't take me long in looking at this case to realize that something was wrong with it. And against my better judgment, I finally said, look, if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. All right. If you run out of money, you're not going to run out of lawyer. I'll keep working on the case. Let's just see what we can do with it. Because my thought was, if I can take the inconsistencies in the case to the prosecutor and show them the inconsistencies, I can probably get them to drop the case. What had happened in the meantime was, as a result of the false confession, the prosecutor takes the case to the grand jury, and the grand jury, if you don't know anything about grand juries, the grand jury only hears from the witnesses that the state wants them to hear. The defendant is not there. The defendant's attorney is not there. And what happened during the grand jury inquest? Well, the fellows from the PCA came in and told the jury the same lies that they had told to the fellow that they got the false confession from about the baseball bat with the blood and hair on it, about the car that matched up, about the witness that saw the car, and this false confession. As a result of that, the grand jury came back with a true bill, and my client and the other 2 guys were indicted for first-degree murder. All right? Now, then they go to B and they say, well, listen, here's what we'll do. If you'll tell that story at trial, we'll drop the charges against you down to obstruction of justice. You'll do a year in prison if we can get these 2 guys convicted. All right? So we're set to go. Now, some of the things that came up in the middle of all of this were, number one, when I see we got this 3 o'clock thing, I eventually went out, had my wife drop me at the party house. It's still there today. She dropped me at the party house. She went up on the highway where the body was found 2.5 miles away in the middle of the night. And she sat there and read a book by flashlight while I walked from the party house up to the scene where the body was found. And I timed it with a stopwatch, and so did she, so I could have a double check. It took me 28 minutes. Then I went back on another date, and I did it again, and I walked a little slower. And that time it took me 32 minutes. And then I tried it a third time, and I walked a little faster, and it took me 26 minutes. So I knew I had a window of approximately somewhere between 26 and 32 minutes that it took him to walk the distance from the party house to where he was found. And the witnesses said that they saw him leave the party house at 3 o'clock in the morning. I knew this guy might have seen a car out there, but he sure as hell didn't see him. Interestingly enough, this guy knew the dead guy. One of the girls that he'd impregnated was Mr. X's cousin, so he had been around, he'd seen him, he didn't see him out there at that time. I'm going back with some of this stuff to the prosecutor's office, and I'm talking to him about it, and I'm not getting anywhere with these people. I mean, no, we got a first-degree murder here. You know, if your client wants to plead to something less, we'll give him a second degree. Okay, well, you know, big deal. One night I went into the jail. Then my client didn't know that I was coming, got him out of his cell into a visiting room, and I had pictures from the crime scene with all the blood, and there was a huge pool, and the dead guy. And I laid the pictures down in front of him all of a sudden, and I just sat back to see what he was going to do. And he reached down and he picked up the pictures, and he looked at them, and all of a sudden he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, and all he had to say was, "They think I did that?" And I knew, for some reason at that point, no, he didn't. I just didn't get the kind of reaction from this individual. He wasn't sophisticated enough, didn't have any criminal background whatsoever. I felt compelled to believe that he was innocent. But I can't get the prosecutors to do anything with it, and we're getting closer to trial. And there were a lot of other things that came up in the meantime, but one of the things that came up was all of a sudden one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, I sat up in bed and I thought about that taillight, and I went onto the internet and I Googled Chevy Impalas, and I started looking at the back end of Chevy Impalas. And I discovered this taillight assembly, but I could only find it on one series of cars, and that was in 1968. So I took some of the pictures, printed them off the internet, and I went to a place in my hometown where there are 3 young brothers, and what these guys do is they take classic cars and they rebuild them for people. I mean, that's their deal. They'll do the reupholstery, they do the body work, they do the paint and the whole thing. So I walked into the place with these pictures, and I walked up to one of them, and this is a kid that's kind of got one of these Elvis hairdos. He's from straight in the 50s. He's got tattoos up one arm and up the other. And I'm talking to him, and he said, "Well, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, maybe nothing." But I held up a picture, and I said, "Tell me what that is." And he looked at me, and he said, "Was this a joke?" And I said, "Not really. I got a guy sitting in prison charged with first-degree murder as a result of this. What is that?" He said, "Well, there's only one thing it can be. It's a 1968 Chevy Impala." And I said, "Why isn't it a 69 Chevy Impala or a 67? Or why isn't it a 1972 Impala?" He said, "It's absolutely impossible. Chevy only used that particular in the back bumper body style of their lights for 1 year, and that was 1968. Prior to that, it was completely different. In 68, they decided to do something cheap because they were retooling their factories to come out with a completely different taillight assembly in 1969. This was cheap. That's the only year they did it. That's a 1968 Chevy." Okay. All right. I also got a hold of a fellow who is a forensic pathologist who at that point in time was the chief deputy medical examiner for Maricopa County, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, a man by the name of Dan Davis. And I sent the pictures and I sent the autopsy to him, and he looked at it, and he came back and we started talking about it, and he said, "Well, no," he said, "could it be a homicide? Maybe. But he said, I got to tell you," he said, "what it looks like to me is a hit and run." And I said to him, "Well, explain to me this." I said, "I'm a fairly good-sized guy," and at that point in time I was still in pretty good shape. I said, "Are you telling me that I can't take a baseball bat, because I used to play ball, and step into it and snap my wrist just at the right time and hit this kid in the side of the head and fracture his skull?" And he said, "You asked the wrong question, because the answer to that question is yes, you can. But I've seen the autopsy photographs, all of them, all the way down to the basilar skull fracture." And he said, "I'm telling you that you could not fracture his skull in that fashion. And here's why. because he said whatever fractured that skull had tremendous mass behind it. It was very heavy. It was moving really, really fast. And the reason that I know that is because that's not a crush fracture. That skull was compressed so quickly that his head couldn't get away from it, and it literally torqued his skull to the point where it snapped through that basilar area. He said in order to do that, you have to have tremendous mass moving at tremendous speed. And he said you couldn't do that with a baseball bat, in addition to which you would have more external tissue damage and more fracturing alongside the head, and you don't have it. Whatever hit him fast, hit him hard, put him dead, and he bled out in a couple of minutes, and he never knew what hit him. And I said, like a piece of farm equipment being towed behind a truck, and he said precisely, like a piece of farm equipment towed behind a truck with something sticking out the side, and he's here along the road at 3 o'clock in the morning dressed completely in black with long black hair, so his face would not have been even very visible, and the rest of him sure as hell wasn't. And you maybe have a tired farmer that's trying to move a piece of equipment in Minnesota in August from one field to another so he can go home, get a couple, 3 hours of sleep, and get his ass back in the equipment and start doing some work the next day. All right, so we've got the taillight issue, we've got the time discrepancy, and we've got this false confession. I can't get the prosecutor to do anything with it. And I keep going back to the prosecutor saying, well, what's the motive? I mean, why in the hell would my client do this? My client didn't even know this guy. And eventually, they cooked up this story where they went back to B. They re-interviewed this guy 6 times. That's important to know. From 2003 through the date of trial, he literally was interviewed by the police 6 times. And every time that I came up with a discrepancy, his next story cleared it up. This was gone, this was gone, this was gone. My brother, who is a criminal defense lawyer down in Missouri, became involved in this because I was emailing him and we were bouncing ideas off each other. And eventually we came up with the idea of going back to the prosecutor yet one more time and giving them the magic bullet, which was basically bullshit. But hey, we found out about this, that, and the other thing. Okay. What about that? Oh, no, that's not enough either. Guess what? They re-interviewed B again, and he cleared up the false story. And the way that he did it was to say, well, the motive was that this guy's fiance was at the party. And this guy came on to her, and so in a jealous rage, he went out into the night looking for him, found him, and beat him to death with the help of his 2 accomplices. Problem was the fiancé was never there, and she could prove it, and we knew that. So we end up going to trial. There's probably a lot more that we could go into. I could probably spend about 8 hours talking about this because I lived with this case for a year, and I didn't sleep for a year. Worried because it's a little bit different, and I know that Tom can vouch for this. It's one thing when you're representing somebody that you know is guilty, even if they want to go to trial. But what the hell do you do when you're representing somebody that you really believe is innocent, and you start thinking, can I do this? Am I going to be good enough to get this guy acquitted on this murder charge?
Yeah, it's bad enough that you're representing a guilty person.
Yeah. And you don't sleep. You don't sleep. I had quit smoking. I started smoking again. Big time. So anyway, we're doing the trial. And we're going through the trial, and the really critical, the forensic pathologist comes in, and he testifies about the fact that he believes it was a hit-and-run accident. I actually got the medical examiner that came and testified. I got her to agree with just about everything that I had questioned her about, which were all fairly innocuous questions, but I didn't want to confront her, because the minute that I come to her and say, well, how do you know that this was a homicide? Well, she's going to have an answer to that. How do you know it couldn't be a hit and run? She's going to have an answer to that. So I went through a lot of questions setting up her testimony for my medical examiner expert so that he could come in and I could hit him with the questions and have him show why her testimony was just patently wrong. I didn't have to make a big production out of it and point at her and get into a big argument. I just had to set her up so that he could come in and say, well, no, here's why it doesn't work that way. Here's why this didn't work that way. Here's why her supposition here is illogical, so that we could do that. Finally, we end up with Mr. B on the stand. And one thing that attorneys really don't like to do, and that's ask somebody on the witness stand a question where they don't know the answer. Not the witness, the attorney. Because when you do, what you're basically doing is just taking dice and rolling them against the wall. You have no idea what the hell you're going to get. So my brother, the night before he was going to be cross-examined, argued until about 11:30 that night as to how I should approach it. My brother couldn't participate in the case. He's not licensed in Minnesota. He's licensed in Missouri. And he had taken some comp time to come up there, and he wasn't sure that his employer was going to be terribly happy. He's a state public defender down there. He wasn't terribly sure that his employer was going to be happy about the idea of coming up there and working the case. So he was my consultant, and he sat right behind us during the entire trial. So we get him up on the witness stand, and we're cross-examining him, and I'm going back through all of these different 6 statements, and I'm talking to him about the inconsistencies in these various statements. And he's admitting, he's not arguing with me, he's admitting every one of them. Well, yeah, that's true. I said something different here. I said something different here. I said something different here. And finally, I turned around to my brother and I looked at him. I didn't say anything to him, but, talk about the telepathy. My look was, shit, I'm going to go for it. And you know what that's like. Yeah. So I turned around to the guy and I looked at him. And I noticed that during the time that I've been asking him these questions, he never looked at me. If this young lady here is me, and he's on the witness stand, he's staring right here. And he's answering my questions, but he's staring right there in the audience. And I finally turned around and looked over my shoulder. There was a little old lady sitting there with tears running down her face. Mom. Okay? So I finally looked at him and I said, it occurs to me that the reason that you're having so much trouble with this and all these different discrepancies and all these different statements is that you really don't know what happened out there that night, do you? And all of a sudden his head swivels around and now he's looking right at me and he says, no, I don't. And I turned around to my brother again and he just went, go ahead. And I turned back and I said, and the reason that you don't know what happened out there that night is because you were never there, were you? And here we get the Perry Mason moment because he just went, no, I wasn't. And I pointed at my client who was sitting right next to me and I said, and neither was he, was he? And he said, no, he wasn't there either. And at that point in time, one of the things that you learn doing this for 26, 30 some years, as an attorney, you learn that there are times when it's just time to shut up. And so I did. And I said, Your Honor, I have no further questions because the jury is getting really restless and I could see a lot of the faces in the jury box and there's some people up there that were clearly, manifestly upset. The audience behind us is very restless, so I rested. The prosecutor jumps to her feet, slams her fists on the counsel table, leans across no farther from the jury than about this, and screams at him in a shrill voice, "You lied?" And he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I lied." And she did it again and she said, "You lied?" Higher. And he looked at her and now his face is getting red and he said, "Yes, I did." And she slammed her fists on the table and leaned over again and said, "You lied?" And I jumped to my feet and I said, "Your Honor, I object." And I get carried away sometimes because what I said actually was something that you're never supposed to say, but I was emotional. I jumped to my feet and I said, "Your Honor, I object. How many goddamn times does she get to ask that question?" Never do that. I got away with it once because of the drama of the moment. And the prosecutor looked at me and she looked back at him and she said, "Why?" And he said, with tears running down his face now, looking back at his mother, "Because I was a young guy and because I was scared and because they told me that if I didn't tell the story that they wanted me to tell, I was going to go to prison for the rest of my life." And then he looked at the jury and he said, but I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. I've done enough. I feel ashamed of myself. And these guys are the ones that are suffering for it. And I'm not going to lie anymore. They weren't there. And none of us had anything to do with it. We knew Jeff. And I don't have any idea what happened to Jeff. Okay? Well, courtroom goes crazy. Judge is banging the gavel on the table. I'm in a state of shock at that point in time. She hadn't called a recess. I just got up and walked out of the courtroom, walked outside and lit a cigarette. I'm standing out there in the street puffing on a cigarette when my brother comes out and grabs me and says, "What the fuck are you doing?" I said, "What?" He said, "She didn't call a recess." I said, "Well, should I come back in?" He said, "No, she called a recess now. You left." So, not the best work I've ever done. Or maybe it was, who the hell knows. Bottom line was that as a result of that, and then the judge put it to the prosecutor and said, "Are you going to dismiss this case at this point in time? I've never seen anything like that before in my life." This is in chambers. "I don't think I ever will see anything like that ever again. Are you going to dismiss the charges?" And she bows her head and says, "No, I can't. My boss, the county attorney, won't let me." Why? Because the day that these guys were arrested after the grand jury indictment came down, the county attorney jumps in his car and drives like a mad bastard to St. Paul, to the state capitol, and is standing out in front of the state house with the governor of the state of Minnesota and the head of the BCA in a daisy chain in front of the TV cameras saying, "We've caught the individuals who perpetrated this violent crime, this heinous crime, and justice will be served." Well, now what's he going to do? Fucked up? No. So he wouldn't let her dismiss the case. So we went ahead, we put on some character witnesses, interestingly enough, who said, interesting thing about Mr. C. During his entire lifetime, and this was a guy who was pretty well put together. Maybe a little taller than I am, maybe a little bit more muscular, well, a lot more muscular than I am. Excellent athlete, went to college on a football scholarship, copped a knee and wound up losing a scholarship. Good athlete, very popular, but had never, ever been in a fight in his life. So my summation to the jury at the end of all of the stuff that we went through was, here is their story. Their story is that my client went with two guys that he didn't even know out into the night at 3 o'clock in the morning searching for yet another guy that he didn't even know and had never seen before in his life and beat him to death. And then for the next 27 years of his life, he never said a word about that to anybody, not even his parish priest. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when they got in the car, supposedly, the 72, well, I'm sorry, was it a 72? I thought it was a 68 Chevy Impala. But everybody's a little confused about that, aren't they? Unless you look at the pictures of the goddamn thing. When they got in that car, supposedly, to drive out to find this kid to beat him to death, my client had to drive right by his parents' house where his parents were sound asleep in bed to do this. Now, if you believe the story, then you've got to convict my client of a first-degree murder. But if you look at the evidence, you'll see basically that the evidence is bullshit. And why? Why? Well, it's real simple. The sheriff's deputy wants to be the sheriff someday. And what better way to become the sheriff than end up cracking the oldest cold case in Minnesota history? The BCA, why would their investigators cook this story up? Well, one of the things that we discovered was that when the BCA was able to report that they'd solved this cold case, they got a grant of $230,000 from the Kellogg Foundation to fund their cold case unit for another 2 years. So when I told the jury, I said, what you've got is kind of a reverse situation. There was a crime that was committed here, but it wasn't committed by these three individuals. It was committed by these individuals, and the motive was money and personal gain. Now, if you believe that that story's true about the car and the times and the baseball bat and all the rest of that stuff, then you've got to convict my client. But if you don't, you've got to set him free. And I sat down. And the jury was excused. And we went back out to have another cigarette. And we're standing out there on the curb, and 12 minutes go by, 15 minutes go by. All of a sudden, the bailiff comes running out of the courthouse and says to me, and I know this guy, I mean, I'm an ex-cop, and so I know all the cops, and we get along well. I fish with some of these guys. He comes running up and he says, "Jesus Christ, you've got to come back inside." And I said, "What the hell happened now?" He said, "The jury's back with a verdict." Now, for criminal defense lawyers, when a jury comes back on a case 17 minutes after the jury's been excused with a verdict, what usually happens? Yeah. We call it AMF. Adios, motherfucker. So I'm walking back, and I tried my best with it. We get in there, the jury comes back in. "Have you reached a verdict, ladies and gentlemen of the jury?" "Yes, I have. Would you please pass it to the bailiff?" Gives it to the court reporter. Court reporter stands up and basically says, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ronald Michaels, not guilty of first-degree murder." There were 5 lesser charges that were included in the indictment. They acquitted him on all 6 counts in the case. Ron Michaels spent a year to the day in jail, 365 days after he was jailed. When he was picked up after the indictment came down, he was released. And so, good for Ron Michaels, except for the fact that it almost devastated them financially to come up with the $30,000 that they had to pay me, $15,000 of which went to my medical examiner expert to get him back from Phoenix, Arizona. It was a bargain, okay? And my brother looked at me later with a grin on his face and he says, "Well, counselor," he says, "how does it feel to handle the biggest murder case you're ever going to handle in your life for a $15,000 fee?" And I looked at him and I said, "You know what? It feels pretty goddamn good. It really does." Only problem was, the story's not over. It almost is. So my client's acquitted. Let's just let these guys go, right? No. They went ahead and prosecuted A for first-degree murder, and they took it to trial. And the night before B was to go up on the stand, and he's facing a pretty tough uphill battle right now, because he's already made this dramatic recantation of his earlier statements, all 6 of them, on the witness stand under oath, in which he says, "We didn't have anything to do with it. These guys weren't there. I wasn't there." Okay? So they go to him, who? These people and the sheriff's deputy, the night before he's supposed to testify, with his mother this time, and they convince him that he's got to go back to the original story, or his deal for the year in prison on the obstruction of justice charge is going to go away, and he's got to go back to the original story. So he does. And in the course of the trial, the attorneys representing Mr. A pointed out this recantation that he'd done on the stand, to which he explained, "Well, that wasn't true. I just got tricked by a smart lawyer." Well, everybody knew that it was me, and everybody knew I'm not that goddamn smart. So they knew that was bullshit, but the jury didn't, and as a result of that, A is now sitting in the Minnesota State Penitentiary doing life in prison. The only other thing that I can say about that is this. A friend of Ron Michaels by the name of Ken Miller. Ken is a technical writer, if any of you understand what that term is, and he lives and works in Chicago, Illinois, or in that area. And Ken came back for the trial. He had grown up with Ron Michaels from the time they were 7 years old. At one point in high school, Ken had done something to anger a bunch of druggies that were going to high school with him, and they set him up. They were going to have him meet them someplace. Unbeknownst to him, the plan was they were going to beat him up for something that he'd done to somebody. And when Ron Michaels found out about it, Ron Michaels went to the area, stood in front of Ken Miller, and said to them, "There's no need to get in a fight here. We don't need to fight. But if you're going to hit him, you're going to have to come through me to do it. And they didn't want any of him at all. Not because he had a reputation for being a fighter, but simply because he had a reputation for being a stand-up guy, and he was built like a brick shithouse. So they took one look at it and decided we don't want any of that. From that point on, he and Ken Miller were almost inseparable. And when Ron's wife called Ken to tell him that Ron had been arrested for first-degree murder, he knew in his heart there is absolutely no way on God's earth that that's true. I'll do whatever I can. And he came back for the trial and spent 3 weeks with us, sitting right behind us, watching all of this transpire. And the process made him so angry that after he got home, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. He finally sat down with his wife and he said, look, I got to do something about this. This cannot go. Because not only was it hard enough on Ron, but we just heard that this guy got convicted and is now spending life in prison. And this is wrong. So she says, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going to write a book. And she said, well, the hell do you know about writing books? He said, nothing, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so he spent the last 2 years working on this book, which is called The Bison King. Why? Because these kids all went to high school in Buffalo, Minnesota, and guess what their mascot is? The bison. Naturally, what else would it be? Go figure. And Ron was the homecoming king his senior year. So that was his inventive title, The Bison King. It's being published by Tate Publishing. They haven't started the media blitz on it yet, which isn't going to happen until August 11th, which is the anniversary of the death of Jeffrey Hamill. Okay? So if I have no emotional investment. Believe me, I got an emotional investment in this case. I will till the day I die. Financial investment, nothing. Nothing. The money from the sale of the book, Ken Miller has dedicated to 2 things. One, putting the Michaels family back in the financial condition that they need to be in so that they can save their house and have groceries on the goddamn table from one day to the next. And the second part is to get Terry Olson, Mr. A, out of prison. That's where the money's going to go. It's not a sales pitch. Please believe me, I'm not trying to do that. But if you are interested at all, you can go to Google. You can Google The Bison King, or you can go to the Tate Publishing website by Googling Tate Publishing, and you can either order the book online or you can just download the book as a PDF file. The whole thing will just be dumped right onto your computer. I did it myself, and it takes less than 5 minutes for the download. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We appreciate your taking the time to share that story with us. It's a sobering realization that we're not always going to come out on the right end of things just based on circumstances. There are people who will misuse information, mistreat people in the investigative process, and certainly abuse their rights in the judicial process. And we look forward to having you join us again for whatever Gail comes up with for podcast number 36. We'll see you all then. Thanks.
Pro Arms Podcast music is by Kevin MacLeod.